One evening, in the middle of March of 1907, a sailor named Nels Nelson stood at the bow of this big Russian steamboat called the Perrier, and he looked out over the Pacific Ocean with a very worried look on his face. The sun was starting to go down, and Nels was afraid of what the night might bring. About a month earlier, the Perrier, the boat that Nels was on, had left Hong Kong and begun its long journey to California, where Nels and the rest of the crew would offload all their hemp and machinery. And just that day, the Perrier had passed by Honolulu, Hawaii, which meant they were nearly to their final destination. Now, their long voyage thus far had been quiet, but now Nels just couldn't help feeling like their luck was about to run out. Nels had been a sailor his whole life. He was originally from Sweden, but he'd traveled all over the world, and a few years back he had linked up with the Perrier in Hong Kong. And now, other than the captain of the Perrier, who was a Russian named Kavinsky, Nels was the longest serving member on board the Perrier. And what that meant was Nels and the ship's captain were the only two currently on board the Perrier who knew the ship's dark secret. Now, Nels and the captain had not told anyone this secret and didn't intend to. Now, this wasn't something they planned, like they weren't trying to keep it a secret. Instead, it was just kind of this unspoken agreement that we're just never going to talk about this. But at the last port in Hong Kong where the ship was docked, the previous entire crew of the Perrier, minus Nels and the captain, had all deserted because of this secret. And so now Nels and the captain were left to kind of keep this information to themselves and go out and solicit a new crew to come on board the Perrier to go to California. But they did it without telling these people about this dark secret. And they'd managed to do it. Nels and the captain had found this kind of ragtag bunch of sailors to come with them on this journey, but as a result of recruiting basically anybody with a pulse who was willing to go on this voyage, the crew they ultimately recruited was kind of an untrustworthy, sketchy bunch. On this night, it was Nels's turn to stand watch, which means basically you would stay up and kind of patrol the boat and look out for problems or emergencies. It was just a way to make sure the crew was always safe, even when everybody was asleep. And even though Nels was not exactly thrilled to be staying up all night to stand watch, in a way he actually was kind of relieved to be in charge of this task. He figured he'd rather be awake and miserable than asleep and vulnerable. Suddenly, another sailor came up to Nels, and Nels hadn't heard him, and the sailor slapped him on the back and said, "Hey, how you enjoying your sunset cruise tonight?" Nels turned around and saw it was another crew member just kind of pulling his leg, and so Nels attempted to put on a smile and kind of go along with the joke and make it kind of lighthearted, but he was really struggling because he was looking off to the horizon and he could see the sun had nearly set. For the next couple of hours, Nels and this other sailor would stand by this railing in the cold night air, and they would just talk about, what they're going to do when they get to California and, what they plan to do with their lives generally, and just kind of small talk, normal stuff. And, for a little while, Nels did forget about all this extreme anxiety he was having about nighttime. But at some point, as Nels and this other sailor were just chatting away, there was this warm breeze that kind of came across the deck of the ship. Now, remember, it had been very cold all night, and so this warm air really stood out. And the second Nels felt that warm air, he knew his worst fears were about to be realized. And so Nels was so scared about what was about to happen that he just kind of froze. He couldn't even turn and tell his partner what was happening. And his partner was totally oblivious because his partner had never been on the Perrier before and didn't know the ship's dark secret. And so this other sailor just kept on blabbering away, totally oblivious. But then, as Nels is frozen to the spot with fear, from down below in the ship, where the crew was all sleeping, they heard this loud, guttural scream, like one of the crew members was being tortured or something. And right away, the guy next to Nels, the other sailor who had been with him, he stopped talking, because now he knows there's a problem. He doesn't know what it is, but obviously something's wrong. Now, Nels was still frozen with fear because he knows what's happening. He knows what's gonna happen. And so he was just standing there, and the other sailor is like, "Nels, what's going on? We gotta go down there." But it wasn't until more screams began coming out of the berthing area down below that Nels kind of snapped out of it, and he was like, "All right, come on, we gotta go." And the two of them, they went bombing down the steps down into the berthing area, and they went into the first compartment where these screams were coming from. And when Nels and his partner walked into this room, they looked and they saw two of their crew members were sitting on one of the bunks, just completely rigid, as if they were totally stiff. And the two of them were just screaming as loud as they possibly could in perfect unison, but it was like they weren't there. It's like their eyes were staring off into the distance and they couldn't control their bodies. Now, Nels knew what was going on here, but the partner didn't. And so the partner's looking at Nels like, what's going on here? And Nels just turned to him and said, look, I think we can quarantine them. Help me move them. And so this partner has no idea what Nels is doing. He doesn't understand what's going on, but he kind of jumped into action with Nels. And Nels and this guy, they grabbed these screaming crew members who were totally stiff, and they remained stiff as Nels and the other sailor dragged them out of the room, down the hall, and they put them in what's called the hold, which is kind of like a jail cell on board a ship. It's where sailors who misbehave get sent to. And so it's a place you can put things and lock the door and they don't come out again. Nels' thinking was, if we can take these affected crew members and quarantine them in the hold, maybe, just maybe, this won't spread to the rest of the crew. But as soon as Nels had shut and locked those two men inside of the hold, it was like the entire ship erupted with screams as the entire crew, minus Nels and his partner, just began screaming like mad. It was like the ship was total chaos. And so Nels and the crew member, they began running down the hall trying to figure out where the screaming was coming from. But before they knew it, the rest of the crew were streaming out of their rooms into the hallway, just screaming and running their way upstairs to the top deck. And so Nels began telling himself, stay calm, it's okay, it's not happening to you yet. But then it felt like someone had reached up inside of Nels' chest and was squeezing as hard as they could. It was like his body was being possessed by something, and then he felt this pressure building up inside of him, and then it was like, without even trying, suddenly the loudest scream that had ever come out of Nels came out of his mouth, and he was completely powerless to stop it. And seconds later, Nels, screaming at the top of his lung, along with his partner, who was also screaming, they joined the stampede of other screaming crew members running their way up to the top deck. And when Nels and his partner reached the top deck, as they were screaming and screaming and screaming, Nels looked around and he took stock of what he was seeing. Again, he's literally screaming this entire time and can't stop it. And he's seeing that's what everybody else was dealing with. There were sailors who were clawing at their faces, almost like they were trying to stop themselves from screaming, but that wasn't doing anything. Others were holding their throats, attempting to stop the screaming. Some others were running into walls and grabbing and fighting with each other. I mean, it was absolutely chaos. And so Nels, he's kind of taking stock of this whole situation, still screaming, and then he notices one sailor in particular, and Nels knew exactly what was going to happen. That one sailor, who Nels did not know well, he was one of the sketchy crew members who were picked up in Hong Kong, he stopped screaming. And Nels could tell because there was this look of absolute calm over this sailor's face. And he was down on all fours, almost like an animal, right out in the middle of the top deck. And Nels, as he continued to scream, watched as this young, now very quiet sailor started to move across the deck like an animal. And as he did, he got faster and faster, like he was galloping on all fours, and he was headed straight for the railing of the ship. Now, Nels, in his conscious mind, he knew what was going to happen next, and he wanted to stop it, but just like he couldn't stop his own screaming, he was powerless to stop what was about to happen to this young man. And sure enough, Nels watched in horror as this galloping young sailor went full speed to the railing and then just leapt clear over it and splashed into the water below. And the second he hit the water, it was like everybody on the ship broke out of their trance. The screaming stopped, and it was eerily quiet. And one by one, each of the crew who had kind of broken out of their trance now began looking around, having no idea how they just wound up on the deck and what was even going on. And they looked at each other to try to figure out, like, do you know what just happened? But nobody knew. And then this very tense silence was broken when one of the crew members who had seen that young man gallop and leap over the side, this crew member, he yelled, "Hey, man overboard, someone jumped over." And it was like that was the thing that everybody was going to focus on. We're going to forget about this absolute craziness that just happened, and we're going to try to rescue this guy. But despite lowering down rowboats and paddling around for nearly an hour and yelling out for this guy and turning their ship around over and over again, they never found him. He never made a single noise, nothing. He just vanished into the night. And that was it. And so after about an hour of searching, the search was called off, and this sailor who had leapt over the edge was declared dead. And once he was declared dead and the rest of the crew were all back on board the Perrier, standing on the top deck, looking around like, what just happened? Nels and the captain looked at each other and nodded, because they knew they would have to tell the crew what just happened. They would have to share this ship's dark secret. And so Nels and the captain told the crew the big secret, and the crew was obviously horrified, but considering they had just been through the entire experience, they weren't exactly surprised. They just hoped that, this night was the only night this craziness would happen. But the following night, the same thing happened. Everybody screamed, went crazy, ran up to the deck, somebody leapt overboard. The next night, same thing happened as well. The next night, so 4 nights in a row of this, the captain just could not take it anymore, and when he heard that first scream echo through the ship, the captain grabbed a pistol, put it to his head, and fired. In early April, the Perrier finally reached San Francisco, California, where the crew was supposed to offload their hemp and machinery. By this point, one of the sailors, whose name was Padaman, had assumed command of the ship, but by this point, the crew were very close to mutiny. They did not want to be on the ship anymore. They didn't care who was in charge. And in fact, once the Perrier got even just within sight of land, there were 9 sailors still on board the Perrier who stole one of the rowboats, lowered it down to the water, and just paddled to land to get away from the Perrier as fast as they could. They didn't even ask to be paid. They just wanted to get away. Nels and the few remaining crew members on board the Perrier docked it in San Francisco, California. They unloaded the hemp, and then the crew actually got back on the Perrier and set sail again and sailed to Santa Monica, California, which was not a very far distance, where they would offload the machinery, so the rest of their haul. And actually on the morning that they were supposed to actually dock in Santa Monica, the crew's cook leapt overboard to his death at 2 a.m., and the crew barely reacted, because by this point, this was just commonplace on board the Perrier, people going crazy and jumping over to their deaths. And so once the Perrier was docked in Santa Monica and all the cargo was offloaded, Nels and the rest of the crew just left it there. They totally abandoned it and just left. And the Perrier would remain totally abandoned in this dock in Santa Monica until a reporter from the Chicago Tribune newspaper found out about what had happened on board the ship and the fact that now it was totally abandoned, which seemed so creepy, and he decided to dig into this, and ultimately he published the story that I'm telling you right now. Here is the Perrier's dark secret that both Nels and Captain Gavinsky knew all too well. 3.5 years earlier, on a night in the fall of 1903, the Perrier docked in what was then called Bombay, but what is now known as Mumbai, India. And on this particular night, some of the crew members of the Perrier decided they wanted to leave the boat and go have some fun. So a few sailors and an officer hopped on one of the rowboats on board the Perrier, they lowered it down to the water, and they paddled to shore. And apparently, this group of guys had a great time on shore, but at some point, the officer apparently killed a guy on land. Who knows what it was about? Nobody knows. The reporter from the Chicago Tribune couldn't figure it out. But the rumor goes the officer killed someone, and when they came back to the ship that night, the officer was bragging about killing this person and even making jokes about it. Now, we don't know if this story actually happened, and we also don't really know if this is the seminal event that prompted what would become the dark secret of the Perrier. But very shortly after that officer had killed someone, the Perrier had left Mumbai and they were out at sea and it was very cold, but then suddenly the crew remembered this warm air wafting over the boat, and then screams rang out from inside as the crew began going totally crazy. This was the first appearance of the Perrier's dark secret, which sailors on board the Perrier actually just referred to as the Thing. Nobody ever saw the thing, or felt the thing, or heard the thing. The only thing they experienced before all hell broke loose is a warm breeze would come across the ship, and then seconds later it was absolute pandemonium until one of the crew members died. And usually it was like the thing inhabited one of the sailors, like that young man who ran like an animal and leapt over the edge, and this thing would basically inhabit these sailors and cause them to take their own lives. Over the next few years, more crews would join the Perrier and go out to sea, and over and over and over again, this thing, the dark secret, would take over and many of the crew would end up dying. And so by the time the crew had come to port, the crew would totally mutiny and disappear. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near this ship. That was why Nels and Captain Gavinsky were the longest serving members on board the Perrier, because they were the only ones who were willing to come back. All told, the thing, or the dark secret of the Perrier, claimed the lives of 23 sailors. 20 of them, after screaming like maniacs, suddenly just went quiet and leapt over the railing into the ocean and drowned, and the 3 others that passed away were the ship's captains, who all killed themselves. After the Perrier was abandoned in Santa Monica, California, it's unclear what actually happened to it, but we know it never sailed commercially again. One night, in a cemetery in Alabama, this woman was visiting her sister's gravesite, and her sister had passed away when she was only 6 years old. And so this woman had really never gotten over that. And so as she's sitting by the gravesite, she begins to hear what sounds like kids laughing and playing and singing songs. But it's the middle of the night and she's in a cemetery, and so she was very confused by this, and so she decided to go investigate. So she got up and began walking through the cemetery towards the sound of these voices, and sure enough, on the other side of the cemetery was a kid's playground, and it was full of kids playing and singing and laughing. And this woman is like, what are these kids doing here? It's the middle of the night. But before she could figure out what was even going on, she heard a scream behind her. She turned around and saw nothing. But then when she turned back around, all the kids were gone. And so this woman is totally horrified. She fled the cemetery. And then that night, when she was laying in bed, kind of going over what happened, at the foot of her bed, she thinks she sees something moving. And so she looks down her bed, and slowly the head of a child appears at the foot of her bed and stares directly. In July of 1848, a 25-year-old man named Phineas Gage got a job working construction on the Hudson River Railroad in New York. At this time in America, railroads were being laid all over the country, and so lots of workers like Phineas were needed to blast rock out of the way to lay down these railroad tracks. And as it happened, Phineas was an expert in explosives. He had learned how to set controlled blasts growing up on his family's farm in New Hampshire, and then later in his life, he had worked in a mine blasting through rock. And so in addition to just being the ideal railroad worker for this time in America, when Phineas actually started working in New York on this railroad, his co-workers immediately started looking up to him. Phineas was extremely smart and energetic. He was this incredible conversationalist. He was charismatic and funny and a natural leader. And so just 2 months into starting this new job, it was no surprise to anyone who knew Phineas or worked with Phineas that he was promoted to blasting foreman, which meant Phineas would lead the explosives team. Phineas was so excited about this promotion that he went to a blacksmith and had a custom tamping iron made. A tamping iron is a long metal rod that's used to pack explosives. When railroad workers wanted to blast through, let's say, a big rock, they would start by drilling a deep but skinny hole in the rock. Then they would pour blasting powder inside, then they'd put a fuse inside, and then using this tamping iron, they would push the blasting powder and the fuse deep into this hole inside of this rock or whatever it was they were blowing up. And then once it was packed, they would ignite it. Usually, tamping irons were sort of rough tools that looked like crowbars, but Phineas really wanted something special to commemorate this promotion. And so Phineas had the blacksmith make this perfectly straight, smooth, 4-foot-long metal tamping iron, and on one end was a pointed side, and on the other was a blunted side. And this rod, it weighed about 13 pounds, and it was about 1.25 inches in diameter. And Phineas loved this tamping iron. He brought it with him not just to work, but basically anywhere he went. On September 3rd, 1848, so not long after Phineas's big promotion, Phineas and his explosives team were blasting through some rock that ran through a forest. And Phineas, he was right up front over the blasting site, helping them prep the explosive. His team had drilled that long, deep, skinny hole into the rock they were about to blow up, and then blasting powder was put inside, a fuse was put inside, and then Phineas took his tamping iron and began packing the powder and fuse deep into the rock. And the way he did this is he used the blunt end of his tamping iron to pack the explosives, which meant the pointed end was sticking out of the rock. And so as Phineas is doing this, someone behind him slipped on a rock. One of his men tripped or something. And so Phineas, with his hands kind of on his tamping iron, turned to the right to look and see what was going on. And when he did this, somehow his tamping iron that was inside of this skinny hole must have nudged against the inside of the rock, created a spark, and ignited the explosive inside of the rock, which meant the tamping iron was basically fired like a missile out of this hole into Phineas's head. It went in his cheek, up behind his left eye, up and out of his skull, and then shot 80 feet away, landing on the ground covered in Phineas's blood and brains. This happened so quickly that for a second after this thing has blown through Phineas's head, Phineas just stood there upright with his eyes wide, and then suddenly a geyser of blood began shooting out of the top of his head, and then Phineas fell backwards onto the ground. When Phineas's body hit the ground, he began having a seizure, at which point his co-workers, who were still kind of shaken up from this sudden blast, they rushed over and tried to kind of position him in a way that he wouldn't hurt himself. But I mean, they're looking at him and he's literally missing half of his head. He's covered in blood, and they're thinking, there's nothing we can do for him but basically wait for him to die. And so all of Phineas's co-workers, who adored Phineas, just stood there very somber watching their boss die. But eventually, Phineas stopped having a seizure, and then he opened his eyes and he looked up at his crew and he sat up and he said, "What happened?" Now remember, half of his head has been blown out by a 13-pound, 4-foot-long metal rod that has shot through his head. And his co-workers, when they heard how clearly he was speaking and how focused his eyes were, they couldn't believe it. How in the world is this guy alive, let alone having a coherent conversation with them? And so the co-workers told Phineas, "Please lie down, we'll get you help, lie down, relax." But Phineas, who still had blood also shooting out of his head, just kind of stood up casually and walked over to the railroad cart and signaled for his crew to take him back into town. And so the crew, they're looking over at Phineas, who now is literally head to toe just red from blood. Still bleeding, but less so, and he's just sitting on the railroad cart waiting for them. And so they walk over to him and they start the slow 1-mile journey into town on this railroad cart. And the whole time they're all kind of looking at Phineas, expecting him to die any second. But instead, Phineas is just kind of looking around with half of his head. And at some point he pulled out his logbook and carefully wrote down what time they were leaving their work site to make sure his crew was accurately paid. And then finally they reached town and Phineas was still very much alive and looking around, acting like nothing had happened to him. And the co-workers helped him to his hotel, and Phineas just sat outside on a chair in front of his hotel, just people watching, while his crew went and got a doctor. A doctor soon arrived, and he too was completely shocked at Phineas's appearance, but even more so was Phineas's eyes. He looked at the doctor, and his eyes were totally focused, like he was all there, totally lucid, looking at the doctor, waiting for him to come over and help him out with his little injury. And when the doctor kind of timidly approached Phineas, Phineas very famously said as he sat on his chair, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." Like everyone else, the doctor fully assumed that despite Phineas's miraculous recovery from this injury, that he would soon die from this horrific wound in his head. And so the doctor moved Phineas up into the hotel, put him in a bed, and then basically made him comfortable. Now, the doctor at this point was not trying to save Phineas. He felt like there was nothing he could do to save Phineas. At this point, it was like mercy. Let's make this as pain-free as possible for Phineas as he inevitably dies from this injury. But Phineas didn't die. He would break out of it and basically be okay again. However, his personality at first, after he came out of this state of delirium, was not really the same. No longer was he this funny, smart, charming, confident leader. Instead, he was this guy who seemed to have lost all of his inhibitions and was kind of childlike. He swore all the time. He would tell people he had these crazy plans he was going to go do, but he would never follow through with them. And he would tell his nieces and nephews these wild stories about himself that were obviously made up and not even close to reality. But overall, he was okay, even though you could see his brain pulsing underneath his skin on the side of his head that had been blown off. And within a couple of years of this injury, those changes to Phineas's personality kind of faded, and he really did become old Phineas. However, there was one unique quirk to Phineas post-injury that never went away. And that was Phineas's kind of unhealthy love for the tamping iron that had blown through his head. After his injury, Phineas kind of stopped making friends, and any friends he did have, he really didn't try to keep those relationships up. He didn't get married, he didn't have kids. Instead, the tamping iron became sort of like his best friend. He took it everywhere with him, even posing at one point with the tamping iron the way you would expect a couple to pose for a photo. 12 years after his horrific injury, Phineas would develop seizures, likely from the injury, and then he would die with his beloved tamping rod right by his side. His case changed neuroscience forever by showing that an injury to the brain could affect specific personality traits. Today, Phineas's skull and his tamping rod are on display at Harvard Medical School. On the afternoon of Sunday, February 25th, 1855, a 48-year-old woman named Hannah Rowlandson, along with her husband and a group of her friends, walked quickly down a road in Sheffield, England. As they walked, the entire group was totally silent because they were terrified of what was going to happen next. Behind Hannah and her friends on this road was actually another slightly larger group of people that were keeping pace with Hannah and her friends. They were actually going to the same place as them, except this second group had no intention of going inside that building. They were just there to see what happened. Now, Hannah and her friends were totally offended and annoyed by this group that was following them, but they knew there was nothing they could do, and so they just kept on walking in silence. And as Hannah walked in silence, she couldn't help but think to herself, how in the world did I get into this position? At the time, Sheffield, England was a big industrial city with lots of metalworking factories all over the place. And so loads of people at the time were coming to Sheffield to work in those factories. And as the population increased in Sheffield, the city began building all these tenement apartments, which are kind of like these low-quality, cramped, interconnected apartments that are basically cheap and easy to make and house lots and lots of people. Hannah and her husband lived in one of these tenement apartments, and they worked in one of the metalworking factories, which meant their lives were pretty rough and difficult. But recently, their lives had become even more challenging when their oldest son had died in a coal mining accident. And this totally devastated the parents, but Hannah definitely took it the worst. In her grief, Hannah became very antisocial and began just going to the factory and doing backbreaking labor all day, and then came straight home. She would go to a room by herself, and she would just sit there all night and pray and try to communicate with her dead son. Now, at first, Hannah's husband basically did the same thing as Hannah. He put all of his energy and his time and his focus on work, even though it was totally backbreaking and miserable, mainly because it was a distraction from this terrible grief he was dealing with. But after several weeks and months went by, Hannah's husband did begin to kind of get back to normal and began to move forward with his life. But he could see Hannah was not doing that. Hannah was totally depressed and isolated, and so he eventually encouraged her to start going back to church and start spending more time with people there, make some new friends, and hopefully being around some people will help you cope with this tragedy. And Hannah had actually taken her husband's advice. She began going back to church, she made a bunch of new friends, she rekindled old relationships, and before long, she was getting that support, and it was helping her kind of move through this grieving process. But ironically, it was this new church support group that had thrust Hannah into a new horrible situation, one that was playing out on the streets of Sheffield, England, as Hannah, her husband, and her church friends speed walked down the road with this big group following behind them. And so in this group of people with Hannah was obviously her husband, as well as her closest friend from church, whose name was Harriet Ward. And then also there was 3 members of the Favell family. There was Mr. and Mrs. Favell, as well as Mrs. Favell's sister. And all of them were headed to the tenement apartment on Campo Lane, where Harriet Ward and the Favell family lived together. Hannah and her group, and the second group that was following them, all came from the same place. They all went to the same church, and that day, for the previous 2 hours before they all took to the streets here, they had been having this really heated argument about what to do about Harriet and the Favell family's basement. Or, more specifically, what to do about what was in their basement. Some parishioners said that Harriet and the Favell family were just totally making up what was going on in their basement. But other parishioners believed them and said that that basement was so dangerous, nobody should go in it. In fact, we should just board up that basement permanently, or we should just level the entire tenement apartment building. And when that idea began gaining some traction, that lots of people in the church began saying, yeah, let's block off the basement or knock the apartment down, the Favell family and Harriet, who lived in this apartment building and did not want to, permanently block off segments of it or knock it down, they got so angry that they just stood up and left. And at this point, Hannah and her husband just got up and left with their friends. Now, once they got outside, they didn't really have a plan, but they felt strongly that they just needed to get to the Campo Lane tenement apartment building and at a minimum, just be in there to prevent other people from showing up and doing something to the apartment, like trying to knock it down or do something to the basement. And so Hannah and her group began speed walking to the apartment, and this gaggle of other churchgoers who were part of this argument just kind of naturally came outside and followed them. And then when Hannah and her friends reached the apartment building on Campo Lane, they went inside and shut and locked the door behind them. And for a moment, Hannah and the 5 other people she was with, they just stood there in silence, not really sure what to do next. But eventually, one of them said, we gotta do something about the basement, because if we don't, the people outside will. Hannah walked over to the front of the apartment where there was a big window that looked out to the street. And when she looked out there, she saw the big group of people that had followed them were all kind of gathering around the small window that looked down into the Campo Lane tenement apartment basement. It was like all these people were jockeying for position to get the best look. Hannah shut the blind in frustration and then walked back over to the group. And then after a few minutes, Mr. Favell said, guys, it's only going to be daylight for a few more hours. If we're going to do something in the basement, we have to get down there before the daylight is gone. We can't be down there in the dark. The group nodded because they understood why. They definitely did not want to be down there in the dark. And then Mr. Favell looked over at Hannah's husband and he kind of gestured like, why don't we, the 2 of us, go down there together? And Hannah's husband, even though he did not want to go down there, he just nodded and said, okay, let's go. Moments later, Hannah, Harriet, and the 2 Favell women watched as the 2 men opened up the basement door, turned around and looked at the women, and then they slowly began descending the stairs. And then after a couple of minutes, the only sound coming out of the basement was the sound of these 2 men using big metal tools to attempt to break up the stone floor in the basement. For the next 2 hours, Mr. Favell and Hannah's husband continued to smash up the floor in the basement, but every time they removed a big piece of stone, all they'd find was dirt underneath. There was nothing else. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd looking in that window into the basement was only getting bigger and bigger. It was no longer just other members of their church. It was now just random people who saw this big group and walked over to see what was going on. And Hannah, who was at that window looking out into the street, she was seeing this group growing and seeing how rowdy they were getting, and it was starting to make her really nervous. But the nerves she felt about the crowd were nothing compared to the nerves she felt about her husband and Mr. Favell still being in that basement now that the sun was about to set. She did not want them down there in the dark. And finally, when the sun did set and the 2 men still had not come up, Hannah just rushed over to the basement and yelled for them to stop what they were doing and get up here. And the 2 men did as she asked. They dropped their tools and came upstairs looking totally dejected. They had not found the thing they were looking for down there, which meant they had failed. But Hannah and her friends were hoping that now that it was dark outside and the people outside could no longer actually see into the basement because it was too dark, that maybe the crowd would disperse. But as Hannah, her husband, Harriet, and the Favells sat down to have some dinner in the apartment, they looked outside periodically and they saw the crowd was not going away. If anything, the crowd was still continuing to get bigger. Now, you got to remember, this is Sheffield, England in the 1800s. This was a tough place to live. Everybody's working at these factories, doing this awful work 7 days a week for very little money, and there's virtually no entertainment anywhere. It's basically just work, work, work until you die. And so when people in Sheffield saw this big group of people at night standing around this apartment window, it was exciting, and that was pretty rare in their lives, and so they were not about to leave and go home because their lives at home were terrible. And so, by about midnight, there was this huge crowd right outside of the Campo Lane apartment, and it meant that, Hannah and her husband really couldn't leave to go back to their apartment. They were kind of trapped because of this crowd. Also, the crowd was really starting to get rowdy, and the Favell family were starting to get worried that a fight would break out near the basement window, and then maybe the window would break, and then these people would storm into their apartment and maybe rob them. I mean, they didn't know. And so Mrs. Favell came up with this plan to try to get the crowd to leave them alone. And so she ran over to one of the biggest windows on the first floor, and she pulled down the curtain rod and the curtain attached to it, and she handed it to her sister and said, "Go down in the basement and use this curtain rod and curtain to block out the one window this crowd has to look into the basement. If they can't see into the basement, then they'll likely just leave." But Mrs. Favell's sister, after being handed this curtain rod, she's like, "I don't want to go in the basement. It's the middle of the night. I'm not going down there." And over the next couple of minutes, the entire group just kind of bickered about who should be the one to go down into the basement to cover up this window. And nobody wanted to do it. And finally, Hannah, who she's lost her son recently, she just wants to go home at this point, but she can't because of this stupid group. She finally just snaps and says, "You know what? I'll do it." And so she snatches the curtain rod and just walks right over to the basement door. She opens it up and begins descending the stairs before anybody else could stop her. And as she did, her husband and Harriet and the Favell family, they all crowded around the top of the basement stairs, looking down, kind of waiting to see what would happen. And so they all heard as Hannah turned the corner and walked over to that window, and they could hear her kind of messing around with the curtain as she put it in place. And then even though they could not see her down there, because the basement's totally dark, they can't see the window, they heard Hannah call out that she was done. She had put the curtain up, it's blocked, and now she was going to come back upstairs. But after she yelled to them that she was coming back up, it went completely silent in the basement. And for like 5, 6, 7 seconds, all the people at the top of the stairs are waiting anxiously for Hannah to turn the corner and come up the stairs to safety. But then this tense silence was broken with a horrible scream coming out of the basement. It was Hannah, and then silence again. And at this point, Hannah's husband, he's like, "Oh my God, something's happened." And he charges down the stairs and he looks over and he sees Hannah is lying on the ground motionless. There's nothing else in the basement. It's just his wife and this covered up window. And so he runs over, he scoops her up and he runs her back upstairs and he lays her on the ground right outside of the basement door. And then he began to shake her to try to wake her up, but she wasn't waking up. However, it was clear she was still breathing, and so Harriet ran and got a wet towel, and she came back and she kneeled down next to Hannah, and she placed the towel on Hannah's forehead, hoping this wet towel would revive Hannah. But as Harriet is kneeling there, so she's looking at Hannah's body, and the basement door, which is open, is right past Hannah's body, Harriet happened to look up, and so now she's looking into the doorway that leads down into the basement, and her eyes went wide, and she screamed, and then she passed out. The big controversy over this basement began several weeks earlier at the beginning of February when Harriet and the Favell family began hearing all these strange sounds coming out of the basement. Now, initially, they had totally written off these sounds as being, strange creaking and cracking sounds that were just the product of a poorly constructed building with lots of people inside of it. But the noises they were hearing from the basement only got louder and louder and more intense, and they were especially bad at night. And so basically, Harriet and the Favell family were so scared to go down there that they just stopped, especially at night. Sometimes they'd go during the day, but at night it was like, no one's going down there. We don't know what's going on, but I'm not going down there. And then on February 24th, so this is one day before all this craziness happened where, Hannah and her friends get followed to the apartment, and then Hannah goes down and she passes out, and then Harriet passes out. So one day before that, Harriet swore she saw a ghost in the basement. she saw this old woman wearing a white gown kind of moving around in the basement, and the whole time, Harriet said this woman, this ghost woman, was pointing at one particular spot on the ground in the basement. And then, the same night that Harriet sees this ghost in the basement, Harriet has a dream. And in her dream, she sees this ghost. And again, this ghost is in that basement and it's pointing at the spot on the basement floor. Except in Harriet's dream, this ghost woman speaks to Harriet and says that she was murdered and her gold was stolen from her and buried in the basement right there. And it was this apparent ghost in the Campo Lane basement that was the center of that 2-hour-long argument at the church the following day, which ultimately prompted Hannah, her husband, Harriet, the Favell family, to get up and storm out to go protect the Campo Lane apartment. And then also the secondary group followed right after them, really just to see if they were going to go confront the ghost, because a lot of people thought that's what they're going to go do. And that is basically what Hannah, her husband, and her friends ended up doing. They decided the two men would go down into the basement and attempt to dig up the floor in hopes that they might find this gold that was stolen from this murdered woman and buried in the basement. But they obviously did not find the gold, which ultimately led to Hannah going down and passing out, and then Harriet also passing out. Hannah and Harriet would wake up after passing out. And when they woke up, they would tell these terrifying stories about what they saw. Hannah said she went down the stairs, she went over to the window where all the crowd was looking in, and she managed to get this curtain up, and then she yelled upstairs to her husband and her friends that she was coming back up. But when Hannah actually turned around to go to the stairs, she realized the ghost was in the basement with her. There was this old woman wearing a white gown standing between Hannah and the stairs. She was blocking her way. And this woman was staring at Hannah really intently. And then Hannah screamed, and this ghost charged at Hannah and basically went through her body. And it was at that point that Hannah passed out onto the ground. As for Harriet, when she came to, her story was even more terrifying. Harriet said after she placed that wet towel on Hannah's head, she looked up and she saw the woman in white walking up the stairs, staring directly at Harriet. And Harriet, she froze and kind of leaned back and just stared at this woman. And the woman, she came right to the top of the stairs. She stopped in the doorway, and then she opened up her mouth grotesquely wide and just continued to stare directly at Harriet. And then with slow, trembling hands, the woman began taking off her nightgown, which eventually fell to the ground. And Harriet saw this woman was covered in cuts and gashes all over her chest and neck. And then Harriet let out a scream, and she passed out too. Not long after Hannah and Harriet both came to and told their horrible stories, the police arrived outside and dispersed the big crowd, which meant Hannah and her husband could finally leave and go back to their own apartment, and they would. But just 12 hours later, Hannah would die. The Sheffield coroner held an inquest into Hannah's death, but he could find no scientific explanation for why Hannah actually died. And so on her death certificate, it basically says she died of fright. She was literally scared to death. Following Hannah's very bizarre and basically unexplained death, Harriet, who would survive, and the Favell family, they just moved out. They could not stand to be at that apartment any longer. And then also many more people who lived inside of this tenement apartment building on Campo Lane, they also moved out because, again, it was just too terrifying to be near this basement. To this day, we still don't have a better explanation for what happened to Hannah. She was in good health, all things considered, when she died. And so really this didn't make any sense. And so this case still is one of the only in recorded history where somebody apparently died just from getting scared. Late one night in the spring of 1937, a young woman stumbled into her New York City apartment building, drunk from a long night of partying with friends. She made her way up the steps and reached her apartment door, and after she opened it up, she stepped inside and her little dog ran up to say hello, and so she gave her dog a pet, and then she walked towards her bedroom. But the moment she stepped foot into that pitch-black bedroom, something just felt off. It was too quiet. But before she could figure out why that was, something heavy came flying out of the darkness and hit her on the face. And for a moment, the woman just